go and ask your people who are listening what they want. The way that we do that is we have a WhatsApp group, a Slack channel, LinkedIn, and also use polls on like Instagram and Twitter to gather insight into what customers actually want and audience members want in terms of listening, learning, and leaning in tools, and then invite the relevant guests. Hi everyone, this is Sonya Barlow, and today I'm going to cover all things podcasts. Now, hear me out. There's a lot of content that already exists on the internet. I believe you, I agree with you, and yet I receive tons of messages every week talking about what is a podcast, how to launch one, how much it costs, how to get people engaged in your podcast, and what to do from a social editing and pushing out standpoint. So I'm going to cover all of that in this video plus more and share some top tips at the end. I've got my notes on my phone, so we're going to go through it slowly. And of course, if there's any other questions or queries that you might have, just drop them in the DMs or under the comments or via email, and I'll be sure to cover them as we go forward. You might know that we started an LMF Network podcast, a visual podcast series. Actually, I was trying to do it for years, but I felt like an imposter and I wondered if anybody would listen. And I guess I just wasn't confident in pushing out content in the same way. And a lot of that imposter syndrome showed up in video content and in written form content. So it's really about building up your own skill set before you push something out. Saying that, podcasting isn't new. And obviously visual podcasts are just video-based podcasts. So you can have them in audio on Google Podcasts, Apple and Spotify, but you can have the visual and video elements on channels like YouTube, and here we are. The reason why we launched the LMF podcast is because we have a mission to build the careers and confidence of 25,000 women by 2025. Now that's a big ask. And honestly, the ask was an accident because I said it once when I was being interviewed, and then it got clipped and it got put online, and then I had to say yes to it basically. But the point being is that's a big number. And given that we're a small team and we're a social enterprise, it's really hard to manage those numbers if you're just doing it on a one-to-one basis. And so a podcast is a great way to storytell, to show representation, to reach a greater audience, to build brand awareness, but also to make sure that whilst we're building the careers and confidence of women, we're also giving them the resources and tools they need to level themselves up. And so what we're doing isn't new, it's not unique, but it's definitely different, right? And I'm different in the sense of there are 5 million podcasts that currently exist, 5 million. On average, the podcast industry is 23 billion. Like that's a number that we don't even comprehend. It's just a bunch of numbers on your screen. And the average listener listens to about 40 minutes of content. Normally, or typically, when they're driving and doing house chores. What's interesting here is that less than 30% of podcast hosts are women, and even less women of color who tick a bunch of different diversity boxes. And so in that respect, we do have a niche. We have a great USP, which is a unique selling point. We are adding value into the ecosystem. We're trying really hard not to just conduct noise. And there's a great storytelling element, which is all about sharing people's careers, their confidence hacks, their failures, their mistakes, and building the capabilities so that you basically can learn from them and go out and thrive. That's the premise of not only why we started a podcast, but also the podcasting industry as a total. A question that I receive very often actually is how much it costs to create a podcast. Now, before we go into how to create one, I would say that for us, it was a trial and error experiment. And so this podcast series that you're seeing online costs us anywhere between 7 to 10K. That includes the studio costs, the camera, the editing, the time, the effort, the reproduction, and also the assets that have been created post-podcast, which are the social content and the scheduling that goes out. That's a hefty chunk of money. And I wouldn't say that needs to be your first investment. So when you're thinking of starting a podcast, please don't feel like you need to start a video podcast because everyone's doing it. If anything, the fact that everyone's doing it is super noisy, and so you need to stand out. But think about how you can use everyday tools like Zoom or Google to trial and to test and to practice your interviewing skills. We had an episode with Maya a couple of weeks ago, and she said that she encourages everyone to start a podcast to improve their public speaking skills. Now, to some extent, I do agree because I think it makes you a better interviewer and you're able to listen and learn from people. But at the same time, what I would say is not everyone should start a podcast. Not everyone needs to start a podcast. And also not everyone is a great interviewer when it comes to podcasting. So don't feel like you have to jump on the trend because there is both hype and pressure around it. You can build up your public skills. You can build up your public speaking skills, your networking skills, your storytelling skills in so many different ways, which we can get onto. But that's really the insight that I would like to share based on the information that I gain. So before starting a podcast, we've already touched on the two different elements. So one is visual and one is audio only. At the same time, it can be visual, but you can do it via Zoom, Google, and then chop and screw it, or you can do it in person like this. For us, it was really important that it was in person because there was a professional element to it, and also because we're able to then bring clients to the studio, which is quite fun, and it shows that our business is booming, which it honestly is. Before you start a podcast, know your why. Why are you starting one? Are you starting it because it's just trendy? Honestly, that's not a good enough reason because it takes a lot of time, effort, and investment from your side. Are you starting it because there's pressure? Again, not a great reason. We're starting it because we want to story tell. We want to share people's story across the masses and reach them at a communication channel of their choice. But also because a big reason as to why our podcast exists is to make sure that we can showcase women who are doing awesome things that don't necessarily get the spotlight, so that we can provide mentorship, role models, and representation where relevant. A bigger reason of that is because the stats around women, gender equality, gender pay, gender equity are still so vast and so big that this is one way of closing that gap, both skills gap, gender gap, and equity gap, with what we would say is the lowest effort, highest impact, right? So anyone and everyone can listen, screen, and watch. The second thing to note, therefore, is what's the purpose? What's the value add? Those two things seem like big, bright ideas, but actually what value are you adding? For us, the big value add is giving you actionable tips, sharing people's real life stories, and making sure that we can help you in your career journey without necessarily having you to invest in like big coaching programs and or courses, which are often quite expensive. And then think about how long you want each episode to be. Now, we've trialed our visual podcast. We've done 20-minute episodes. We've done 45-minute episodes. We've even got one which is an hour. Again, the first year is all about trialing and testing and gaining customer feedback. So there's a top tip there is go and ask your people who are listening what they want. The way that we do that is we have a WhatsApp group, a Slack channel, LinkedIn, and also use polls on like Instagram and Twitter to gather insight into what customers actually want and audience members want in terms of listening, learning, and leaning in tools, and then invite the relevant guests on. What I don't do personally is I don't think of a topic and then ask the relevant guest. What I tend to do is I think of the relevant guests and then make a topic for them. But we'll get on to how to reach out to guests in just a second. Outside of that, when you are thinking of launching your podcast, please do some research. I listen to so many podcasts that actually have no value add, no vision, no mission, and they feel like they're doing something super unique. And actually, a lot of that content has already been shared or said. A lot of the speakers are the same. And so after a while, it gets quite both tiresome and repetitive. So before we started our podcast, I think we spent about 6 to 9 months just listening to a bunch of podcasts that we were interested in our area, kind of careers, business, inclusion, tech, as an example, and just seeing where the gaps were so that we could create the scripts accordingly. For me, scripts are quite important, but I would counter that and say that when you are creating podcast scripts, it depends on what works for you. I have notes on my phone, and that is where I'm at because I guess I podcast for a living, right? Like I have my own radio show. But for people who are new or learning, a script is quite important. So you can write down the questions, the bullet points, and just ensure that everything is where it needs to be. You can see that I'm not talking about the guests right now. We'll get onto that. And you'll see at the bottom where the timestamps are if you just want to skip ahead. When we first started our podcast, we trialed and tested the first 10 episodes, and I'm a big believer of that. My brain is a business brain, right? And so in business, this is called an ideation stage or iteration. And fundamentally what that means is that you're creating a smaller sample set within a period or time frame that you've designated and testing out different locations, different sound mechanisms, different backdrops. So you might see in the LMF podcast, we have a bunch of different backdrops, and we've even worked with different editors to see what really vibes and what we like and what topics are booming. And to this day, the most popular podcast has been the one around job interviews and ghosting from recruiters. And that was with our partner client Taboola. And that's probably because it's a relevant topic, because it makes for good YouTube content, and also because it's a great way to learn what you don't know, especially when you're going through interviews. And interviewing is such a common thing that most people do, especially when you're in the workspace, that it's always going to be evergreen, meaning that it will naturally drive traffic as it grows. Whereas when we talked about the charitable space and where we talked about raising funds in grants and through social sponsorship, that didn't receive as many great views or listens, though the impact was high because we had a smaller set of users, listeners, and audience members who were able to tune in and take away what they wanted. It just meant that it wasn't a topic for the masses. But the reason I share that is because we truly trialed and tested our first 10 episodes. And that was something that we also thought about when we did the cost, right? Like I said, it cost about 10K to make this podcast. And so it's quite expensive. When you have interviewed, when you are editing, make sure that you know your editor. We've worked with several editors right now. One is we did a shout out and went through various interviews. My top tip there is make sure that you have a small podcast segment that you can get different editors to edit for you in terms of a test and sample. Give them feedback, and if there needs to be compensation, give them that too. But also don't go for the first one that comes along, and equally set a contract in place to make sure that this particular person has to edit 5 to 10 to 15 episodes within this time frame, and this is the cost of that delivery, and something is delayed, these are the late fees. I only say that because we had an editor who was great, but then new work came up in their life, and so we were delayed on our end, and so we had to go sourcing once again. And then when it comes to social content, right, you've uploaded your podcast. My top kind of account to use is Anchor. Anchor is great because you can then redirect it into Google, Spotify, Apple, but there's tons of various different platforms out there, and then you have to upload it onto YouTube. This is where AI comes in. There's two uses of AI, right, when it comes to podcasting. One is you can really optimize your headline, your description, your hashtags, your tags using AI. And honestly, it's changed the way that we do things because it's so time and cost effective, and it's super easy, which means that you don't have to outsource. But two, and this is the game changer, there are AI tools out there now that create shorts for you from your visual podcast and your audio podcast. And so based on the data that you're feeding them in, they will then create what's relevant. So that means what used to take me now 2 days probably takes me about 2 hours. And then you have 15 to 30 clips that you can clip up and schedule using tools like Later or Buffer or Hootsuite on TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, whatever it might be. And it just makes so much sense. And then you just have a lot of fun, right? Podcasting is meant to be fun. I'm not serious when we podcast, and I'm that by design. I like to put my feet up. I like to wear what I want. I like to make it informal because that's the vibe that we want to give off. But again, we want to be a professional business, hence the professional setup. And if you want to know who our podcasting studio is, there's a link somewhere in the comments, so you can look into that too. But I would say that if you're starting out as a business or a social enterprise or a hobby or nice to have, you probably don't need to make such a glossy or professional investment. You can just see how you can make it work through online forums. So a good example being, I was recently on the ADHD Chatter podcast, and he records via Riverside and Zoom, chops and screws the video content and pushes it online. But that's doing really well, and that's super cost effective. And so you've got to think about what really makes sense for you. One thing I missed out, and I appreciate, but it's because I wanted to talk about people in a whole different segment, is knowing who your target market is. So who is your podcast demographic? Where are they? Are they going to listen? Do they care? Because not everyone cares about what people are talking about, right? There are so many podcasts in the world. Everyone's just talking and sharing their story. But that itself can be quite overwhelming and pretty noisy. So we learned, given that our platform is female-centric, we would say we therefore believe and assume that 65 to 70% of our listeners are female, that they are interested in building their confidence in careers, that they want to enter the workplace and or thrive in the workplace and or build businesses, that they are into social media, that they are disposable income, that they have disposable income, that they enjoy traveling, that they think about self-care, but also they want to continuously learn and upskill themselves. And so not only is our content created in that way, our speakers are chosen in that way, but also we're very aware of what our end user wants. And so that's super important when you're creating scripts, when you're thinking about your setup, when you're even thinking about podcasting, when you're sharing content online, but also when you're gaining customer feedback. Is I'm assuming that this is what you're taking away. What is it that you're actually taking away? And the quicker that you can gain customer feedback, the easier it is for you to adapt, which is what we've started doing now. So if you take a look, our first 10 podcasts were slightly different to the new ones that we're rolling out, from the people we're inviting, to the content that we're sharing, to the interview questions themselves, to how fun and informal it is, all the way to the time span. And so it really is about adapting and being that iterative approach. A question that I often get is, how do you get so confident recording podcasts? And I've literally written a bunch of notes down to share with you all. So I think the first starting point is know your why, know your audience listener, and also know what you want to gain and get away from each episode. Prior to episodes, I research my guest. I create a mini script with questions and a work in progress theme that I then send to them to sign off. During the podcast itself, arrive early. If you're online, join early and just make sure you get a setup of the room, you get a vibe of where you are, and you wear something that makes you feel confident. I always try and wear an outfit that makes me feel confident, and have nail color on, or a lippy on, or a bit of mascara, because that's my power armor and it makes you feel good. Also, posture is key. It may look like I don't have the best posture, but honestly, I do. Not have the best, but I do have good posture. But I'm comfortable in the way that I am. Know that your voice really does need to be amplified. Now, because I work for the BBC, already have a good idea of how the voice should be. So a good example being, I'm currently this much away from the mic. That's standard great practice when you are podcasting. If you're too close or you're too far, it's going to change the noise. I think you heard me bang. We're going to keep that in because actually that's also not great. Try not to bang on things when you are recording, or wear something that's jangly and dingly that's going to make noise. The key to podcasting is to listen more, to ask questions, and to take a step back. You are not the guest. The guest is there to be interviewed and to have a conversation, or to strike up a good, memorable discussion. And so even if there's 2 or more of you are having a discussion, always have someone who's leading and making sure that you have certain questions or topics and themes that you want to cover during that session and segment. It may sound like fancy podcasts and the ones that are famous don't do that, but actually they do that even more because they have a whole production team around them, right? So this is top tips for you to know now, because that's what I do when I'm at the BBC, and it sounds like we've just winged it. To some extent we have, but even that winging of a podcast takes about half a day to a day before that 30-minute clip goes out. And then slow down your speech. I only say that because I personally am quite a fast talker and I enjoy talking, but I realize that you have to really articulate your words and take a breath. And it's okay if there's gaps. You'll see a lot of video content, a lot of podcasts and audio content that try and clip everything as if there's no breath in between. Actually, that's not organic, and that's not how our brains work or function and or absorb information. So keep it as natural as possible. And lastly, but most importantly, bring it back to the guest, or the person on site, or the key theme, the key topic, and make sure that you're always going in a circular approach. So a top tip there, and what really makes me a great podcaster, right? And this is the feedback that I get as well, is that I'm able to loop the beginning segment of the podcast to the end and bring it back in a full circle. And you also learn a lot of that from watching movies and listening to music videos and watching documentaries online. Is they'll start with a key theme at the front, or they'll start with a key theme at the first segment, and then they'll seem like they're digressing, but then they'll bring it back towards the end. And there's a lot of scientific research and psychological research to suggest that helps to loop in a consumer's mind, and it helps them to really understand the topic as a whole, but it also enables memory and keeping things in the front of mind when it comes to pivotal discussions. So a couple of things that I just want to touch on before we start wrapping up, and maybe we'll edit that bit out, but that's fine. So far we've discussed what is a podcast, the stats around podcasting, knowing your why, understanding your audience, allocating time and resources, investment into podcasting, pushing it out. I would say when you think about the metrics and the metrics to measure, we personally don't look at how many listeners there are and what the likes and the following count is. The first 25 podcasts for us are literally just get them out. Let's do something really cool. Let's get it out. And that's our first measure of success. The second is when the guest enjoys the discussion. So then we get real-time feedback. And the third is then feedback from our focus groups and or our audience and listeners via social media. The point being is, if we're on a mission to build the careers and confidence of 25,000 people by 2025, right? Because that's our end goal. Even if we impact one person and do it well, we've won. And so it's not necessarily about the reach. It's about getting something out and knowing that one message, one key takeaway, one decision, one conversation, one story can change someone's life. And that is our measure of success. And I'm really grateful that has really been a driving factor in what we do and how we've established ourselves as a business. What I do want to touch on, this bit might be slightly controversial, is when you're reaching out to speakers and you're asking them to be on your podcast. And I only say this because I'm very blessed that I receive so many requests from people to be on their podcast. And I'm always, I want to say yes, right? But, and there's a big but, if I'm receiving an email from you and it says something along the lines of, "Hi Sonya, I'm launching a new podcast. I'd love for you to be a guest. Let me know." Great, that's good for you, but it's not providing any information. So when we do outreach and we invite guests on, if we don't already know them, we introduce ourselves and our business, the purpose of our podcast. We also create a media pack so that we can have either mood boards of what the podcast and the audio visuals are going to come out as, and real life examples. We talk about the prior guests that we have or the guests that are coming on. We also give some metrics like how many listens, how many views, what the engagement looks like, what the demographic is, how many women listen versus men, what countries they're based in, what topics they're questioning and asking about. But equally, I always make sure that in that email template, I'm doing an introduction to me as to why I am the host, what credit or experience I have, and why this person would make a great guest. That's really important. Like if you're not researching the guest and if you're not saying, "Hey, that was a really interesting Instagram post you did about traveling. I've got travel podcasts. This is what we cover. We'd love for you to be on it, and this is what we would like as a takeaway," then it's really pointless, because people like to know that you've actually invested in learning about them before they come on and maybe do something for you. That's just general human nature. And I think it also makes you look more professional and more friendly and just nicer and kinder. And this is not me like venting, and maybe it is slightly in the same time, but it definitely is just a current pet peeve of mine. The expectation that you're going to drop someone an email and they're going to reply back straight away. Like, people are busy. We spend over 3 hours on our phone, on our emails every day. And there's now hyper productivity to a point where we're not productive when it comes to email management. And so it's really easy to get lost in the sauce. But if you're making it really clear as to, this is us, this is what we do, this is why we picked you, this is what we like about you, this is what we want to cover, these are some bullet points, this is the time, place, destination, expectation from your end, and also this is what the output looks like. So we always make it clear that actually the output is the full video and the shorts. More people are going to be inclined to say yes, and it's going to make your life much easier. And then some final points that I just want to share before we wrap up, especially if you're thinking of starting a podcast, or you already have one, you're thinking of upping your game, or you're doing some outreach for guests, like whichever area of interest it is. Towards the end of each episode, summarize what you've learned so that you're bringing people back. Don't be afraid to fail. Failure is so important when it comes to anything and everything in life. I don't think of it as failure. I think of it as iteration or trying or trialing and erroring. You just have to take a scientific approach with things and also understand your measure of success and what metric really makes sense to you. So again, for me, we just want to get something out there. We want to storytell. We want to interview as many guests as we can. We want to talk to cool people, and we want to make sure that their careers are being represented. That's the starting point. After that, the views, the more vanity metrics are really important. But given that there's a ton of ghost accounts and you can buy likes and shares, and it doesn't mean that it's actually impactful, that's lesser in what we are interested in measuring. So in summary, hopefully this has been an interesting video. I hope so. And remember, I'm also trialing and testing solo videos to the screen. So give me all the feedback that you want, because this is a part of me testing out what works, what doesn't work, what can be better, what people actually want from the conversation. But a lot of what we've shared has been based on the amount of questions that I've received on how to start a podcast, what makes a good podcast, what makes a bad podcast, how to reach out to guests on podcasts, and what your measure of success should be. So on that note, I wish you so much luck if you're looking to start one. And hopefully it's successful, whatever success means to you. And one thing that I'd love for you all to do is to like, subscribe, and share our visual podcast, because who doesn't want that, right? And if you have any questions, any thoughts, or any queries, just drop me a DM or put them in the comments or send me an email, and then we can do more video content just for you.